Hey folks, Scott Weingart here, and this is the emcrit podcast. Today, I guess what is an annual event, or at least annual, if not more, which is the sepsis update for 2019. And what spurred it? Well, there's been a host of kind of amazing articles published recently. I mean, Society of Critical Care Medicine just happened, and there's been some other stuff. So I figured today's the day. Now, as usual, the other folks on the team over here at emcrit have scooped me on all of these. That is just the way of the world. When you have amazing bloggers, they will almost always beat the podcasters, and that's okay. It works out well. You could read other people's takes on the things you're going to hear here. Now, the first thing to discuss is, as usual, the question of fluids. And I'm not going to go into my mea culpa. Fine, I'll go into my mea culpa. The one biggest mistake I've made in my career was the profligate use of fluids for sepsis that I pushed early on in my career. I only offer as explanation, not as an excuse, that everyone else really smart in the U.S. was pushing this as well. And I just did not see the error of my ways until later on. But now I am fully indoctrinated in, I think, the correct vision on this stuff, which is lots of fluid given aggressively is bad for most septic patients. Do not do it. Now, how do we avoid doing that when we live in a country that mandates it? 30 mLs per kg for septic shock identified by a lactate greater than 4 or hypotension. The only thing I want to say about this is, because I think some folks might not know, is that those 30 mLs per kg can be based on ideal body weight. This was changed recently because of lobbying by various folks, and this is good, but it means somewhere on the chart it has to say the ideal body weight. Now, I think, don't go by me, but ask your regulatory people at your hospital, but I think if you write based on my assessment of ideal body weight, you don't have to justify what that assessment is. And I think that line alone would be good, but you have to write something on the chart saying you're dosing your fluids based on ideal body weight. Someone correct me if they're smart, septic-based, regulatory type people, but I think you're good to go on that. The other thing is your infusions of medications count, but they need to be finished within the time window for those 30 mLs per kg. But these are just two tips to avoid doing what I think is really bad, which is giving fluids to patients that don't need it. And if you want my rule of thumb, every patient probably deserves an initial bolus. And in most patients, that 30 mLs per kg is probably okay. And I call those my wins. I call those the patients, I'm going to comply because I think it's okay anyway. And then those wins make up for my losses, which are patients who, for whatever reason, based on my ultrasound assessment, their clinical assessment, their pre-existing comorbidities, I don't think 30 mLs per kg is a good idea. And in those patients, those are my losses. And so I stack up some wins to make up for the ones that I'm just not going to do it. Here in New York State, we actually have laws dictating our care of septic patients. Now, the nice thing is they allow you to write on the chart, I don't think this patient would benefit from the 30 mLs per kg, and that I think they'll be harmed by it, and then you're off the hook. But that doesn't work for the national government. So you just have to pick your poisons and take your losses. Okay, enough on that. Let's talk Andromeda shock. Recently published, came out in Society of Critical Care Medicine by Hernandez et al. You can find the actual reference in the show notes for this episode. But wow, was this an interesting study. There's some fascinating stuff in here. I don't know quite what to do with it, but it certainly makes you think. So I'll go through it. It's not journal club level, so if you want that, you go to the bottom line once they publish their Andromeda shock post, which I'm sure will happen soon. It hasn't happened yet. But here's the deal. These were patients in ICU at multiple institutions. And these patients had already in the ED gotten 20 mLs per kg, or wherever they were coming from, 20 mLs per kg of crystalloid. They have lactates greater than 2, and they're on vasopressors to maintain their blood pressure. So these are really, really sick patients. And, based on their initial lactates and stuff, they're much sicker than your average septic patient. So not just ICU level septic patient, like sick patients. And, to get patients like this, in my experience, the way it happens is these patients have waited on their septic disease state for a while before coming to hospital. That's how you get patients who are this sick. In my neck of the woods, patients at the, first sniffle show up to a hospital. And so you'd never get the lactate levels you have on entrance to this study. So these are sick patients. And now what they did over the 8-hour study period is they compared these patients into they put them into two groups, a lactate resuscitation group, meaning they're basing their resuscitative strategies on lactate clearance. And in this case, it was, did the lactate clear greater than 20% over 2 hours? So it had to drop by 20% every 2 hours in the lactate group versus a capillary refill time group. And in these patients, every 30 minutes, they'd go in and use a very standardized way of checking capillary refill time. And they would actually use a glass slide, they'd blanch the finger, and then they'd use a stopwatch to figure out how long it took. And if it took greater than 3 seconds, that was considered abnormal. And now, what they did, if your lactate was not clearing in the lactate group or your capillary refill time was greater than 3 seconds, was they first assessed fluid responsiveness. That was what this would spark first. And that was done by very good standardized evidence-based means, whether it was passive leg raise or pulse pressure variation, or, you could look at the actual study to find out all the different ways they allowed that, but all of them were evidence-based. All of them were very well tracked, and I think it's good. If you believe in volume responsiveness, which I do not, as a means of determining fluid, the methods they used were excellent. And so if you were volume responsive based on these assessments, they would give you a fluid bolus. They'd give you 500 mLs every 30 minutes. And they do that until either your capillary refill time got better or your lactate cleared. Now, here's where it gets kind of cool. If you were not clearing your lactate or your capillary refill time was bad, but you were not fluid responsive based on all these assessments, then the next thing they would do is they would ask, did you have chronic hypertension based on, your chart, your family, et cetera? And if you were chronically hypertensive, they would do a vasopressor challenge. They would take them from the 65 goal to a 80 to 85 goal and see if that caused lactate clearance or improvement of the capillary refill time. And surprisingly, in many cases, it did. Now that's interesting. Think this through. Why would increasing your blood pressure increase your lactate clearance or make your capillary refill time better? When you think about the capillary refill, that's where it becomes really interesting, because when you think about it, vasopressor should make your capillary refill time worse potentially, and yet it made it better, which means it can't be from direct vasoconstriction itself. That would do the opposite. So it either had to be salutary effects on the heart, better coronary perfusion and therefore better cardiac output, or effects on the neurohormonal milieu, to affect microcirculatory things. But basically, vasopressors made some patients better, and they got their capillary refill time better or cleared their lactate. That is interesting. Now, if you were not chronically hypertensive or you failed the vasopressor challenge, then the next step was an inodilator challenge. And they would actually put them on something like dobutamine or milrinone and see if that improved their capillary refill time or their lactate clearance. And that also worked in some patients. And so basically, you could see the protocol itself on the show notes for this episode. Take a look. It's really, really interesting. Now, what were the differences between the two groups? Less fluid in the CRT group, which might mean that the patients, since both of them, if they were not, effectively getting their goals, then had fluid responsiveness assessment, it potentially means that CRT was a better marker, or a marker that tracked better patients who were doing okay, and therefore they didn't even get their fluid responsiveness assessed to see if they needed more fluid, because if their capillary refill time was good, it didn't matter if they were volume responsive. That's one potential interpretation. And you might say, well, that might be why there is a better outcome, if there was, in the CRT group. Was there a better outcome? There was a 34.9% mortality in the CRT group and a 43.4% mortality, 28-day mortality in the lactate group. So a pretty impressive difference there. Almost 9% difference. Now the problem is the authors powered this trial, as in they collected enough patients to find a 15% mortality difference. So this study was underpowered, and therefore this difference of almost 9% did not reach statistical significance. They would have needed more patients. And this is kind of weird, and this is one of the burning questions I have for the lead author, and we'll try to get him on the show, is why would you power a trial like this to have a 15% mortality difference? That would be unheard of. Things like that do not occur. If you could eke out 2 or 3% in a septic population, you say, yay, this is